Life is defined by relationships. This is perhaps nowhere more obvious than if you look at someone's wedding album. A wedding is a unique occasion where all kinds of relationships collide together. There's, of course, the forming of a new family unit as the bride and groom come together in that ceremony. But there's also, in the makeup of the wedding party, the previous relationships, close friendships, siblings that are evident. There's a mother and father of the bride and groom. Grandparents are present. The assembled congregation of friends and extended family who bear witness. There's the relationship of the church that is present to bless the union. And in most contexts, some sort of state license, the relationship to broader society as it is a legal arrangement. It represents a web of interconnected relationships that we as humans exist in at all times. Our lives are defined by relationships. As I look at the pictures of Kelsey's and my wedding, I'm struck by the fact that there are 3 men to my left in those pictures, my best man and 2 groomsmen. My best man, my second, was my brother, who remains to this day one of my closest friends. The other 2, one of whom I remain in some distant contact with in California, we remain close. The other is a friendship that is no longer in my life, not by my own choosing. One day, he got married without telling anyone, showed up at my house a couple months after the fact, explained what had happened, and said I wasn't going to see him very much after that. And he was right. That left a mark on me. Relationships are like that. They're sources of some of our greatest joys and some of our deepest hurts. None of us are immune from the impact that relationships have on our lives. And so as Kohelet is exploring the nature of our lives, the nature of life under the sun, and is determining that so much of it is hevel, that Hebrew word for merest breath, a vapor, something that's hard to grasp, something that lacks substance, is so temporary, and ultimately seemingly meaningless. He's going to now look at relationships. There are 3 types of relationships that Kohelet is going to look at in the passage we're considering today. And the first of those are relationships of power. Relationships in which there is not an equality of power between the 2 parties. Relationships of hierarchy. And Kohelet, not unique in this observation, will see that that does not usually lead to good outcomes for all concerned. So we're going to begin looking at Ecclesiastes, and we'll begin with a verse that we looked at last week, Ecclesiastes 3:16. Kohelet is again looking at things that he sees. He will continue to look reality in the face. And here in Ecclesiastes 3:16 he says, "And further did I see under the sun the place of judgment, wickedness there, and the place of justice, the wicked there." So Kohelet has already identified that in the web of human relationships, we form societies, and there are places where justice and judgment are to take place to ensure that good prevails and wickedness and injustice do not prevail. And yet he sees that in those very places, wickedness and the wicked are in fact present and holding court, exactly where righteousness and justice ought to hold court. And then in chapter 4, he returns and considers this and says, "And I went back and saw all the oppression that is done under the sun. Ah, the tears of the oppressed. But there was no one to give them comfort. On the side of their oppressors was power, but there was no one to give them comfort." Kohelet turns and sees oppression running rampant throughout society. And the key factor is that the oppressors on their hand have power, and they use it to extract tears from those they oppress. And Kohelet says that the oppressed have no one to comfort them. Twice he repeats this sad statement, that in this relationship there is only the oppressor and the oppressed, and there is not a third party to bring balance to the relationship, to establish justice and righteousness. And we don't need to look far, either in our own history or in our current circumstances, to see that not much has changed. We can continue to see the wicked in the place of justice. We can continue to see oppression, inequalities of power on a number of vectors in our society, whether between the rich or the poor, the political elites and the rest of us, whether between men and women, or between different ethnicities and racial groups. We don't have to look far to see that there is still oppression and injustice in our midst, and always has been. And Kohelet sees it. And here's where Kohelet differs. The rest of Scripture is equally clear-eyed about the realities of injustice and oppression. The prophets exhort the people of Israel, and especially Israel's rulers, to do something about it. The Psalms and the Proverbs are confident that even where the rulers do not do anything about it, God will. They are confident that God's justice will reign. The psalmist over and over again cries out from oppression and says, "But I know God redeems the lowly and the brokenhearted." But see what Kohelet says in response to what he sees. "And I praised the dead who have already died, more than the living who are still alive. And better than both is he who has not yet been, who has not seen all the evil deeds that are done under the sun. And I saw all the toil and all the skilled deeds, that it is a man's envy of his fellow. This too is mere breath and hurting the wind." Kohelet considers the oppression and the injustice and says, it would be better not to have been born. This echoes sentiments that Job expresses in the midst of his injustice, his unjust suffering, when he says, "Cursed be the day that I was born." Jeremiah, when he sees the plight of Israel and the injustice that runs rampant in Israeli society, but also the injustice of the Babylonians coming and taking the people into exile, he says, "Cursed be the day that I was born. Would that I had not lived to see this." When Kohelet sees oppression, he's not insensitive to it. He sees it as a grievous evil, but it leads him to some sort of despair to say, this makes life not even worth living. That's how bad it is. But then he has some counsel later on in chapter 5 for the rest of us who might see injustice. In Ecclesiastes 5:8 and 9, he encourages us that if you see in a province the oppression of the poor, the violation of right and justice, do not be surprised by the affair. For over one official another official keeps watch, and still over them are officials. An advantage for a country in every way is this: a king for the tilled land. Scholars aren't entirely sure what to make of what Kohelet says here, but he tells us not to be surprised when we see oppression and injustice. Our patterns of life under the sun are often formed by these sorts of interactions. Kohelet envisions a world in which there are layers of bureaucracy, and anyone who's had to deal with the Secretary of State or an insurance company or any sort of government bureaucracy knows that there are all of these layers, and there's always someone that they have to hand you off to, even if it's calling customer service and having to speak to someone's supervisor. There's a labyrinth of power relationships, and we're just trying to get to the one who can fix it all. And Kohelet alludes to the fact that that's what kings are supposed to do, but it seems as though he has his tongue planted firmly in his cheek in speaking about the king, because kings were no more guaranteed to be righteous and just than the officials who ruled under them. And so Kohelet says, don't be surprised. The life of humanity under the sun is a constant competition among these power relationships. Don't be surprised. Don't waste much mental energy on it. And earlier in chapter 4, as we read, he said that the reason for this is a man's envy of his fellow. Human sinfulness dictates that this will indeed be the pattern of things under the sun. And so I invite us to pause here and ask ourselves, where have we seen oppression under the sun? Where have you personally experienced injustice? It might be in the myriad small ways that in our personal relationships we experience those small slights, those small unfairnesses. It could be something far more systemic in society that you've encountered. Many of us don't experience serious oppression or injustice personally, but if we have our eyes open, we do see it. And so secondly, I would ask us, when we see it, what response does it prompt in our heart? Kohelet indicates that it's a grievous evil and yet shouldn't surprise us. How does oppression prompt your heart to respond? Kohelet turns from relationships of power and turns to partnership, relationships that are equal. And here we might expect to find some good news. And these are familiar verses. We read them earlier in the service. Ecclesiastes 4:7, again, Kohelet went back, turns to see something else. And I went back and saw a mere breath under the sun. There is one without a second, neither son nor brother he has. And there is no end to his toil, nor is his eye sated with wealth. And for whom do I toil and deprive myself of good things? This too is mere breath and an evil business. Kohelet envisions a man without an heir, a second. This word two, or second, is going to be throughout these verses as Kohelet considers this idea of partnership. And in the ancient world, this would have been centered around a man and his sons, his brothers, his close companions in work and labor. And so he first considers the situation of someone with no children and no brothers to pass property on to, and suggests this is meaningless. This is mere breath, to be alone in the world. And then proceeds to consider how having companions and partners is in fact better. And so continuing in verse 9, Kohelet says, two are better than one, for they get good payment for their toil. For if one should fall, one can help the other up. But woe to a single person who falls, for there is no second to help him up. If two lie together, they are warm, but as for one, how will he be warm? And if one should attack him, the two will not stand against him, and the triple cord will not quickly be snapped. And so we see that Kohelet has first envisioned aloneness, that one of the tragedies of human life is that we're built for relationship, but we don't always find people to be our seconds, to be our companions. But now, as we look at these verses that seem to rejoice in the blessings of companionship and friendship, we see that there's a real utility to these relationships. There's not a close intimacy. There's not a relational bond. There's financial gain, certainly. There's physical security. There's physical warmth. There's defense. But there is not real relationship. And how often is that the case? That we find ourselves in transactional relationships that simply are mutually beneficial, but not based on confidence and loyalty and trust and intimacy. And so finally, Kohelet considers a third type of partnership. And it returns to this idea of the heir. In verse 13, better is a youth poor but wise than a king old but foolish, who can no longer heed a warning. For out of a prison he came forth to reign, although in his kingdom he was born poor. I saw all the living who move about under the sun, on the side of the second youth who will succeed him. Kohelet tells this story that has been told dozens of times throughout history. An old doddering king who's lost wisdom, but is still the ruler, and is replaced by a young but poor person who rises from obscurity, rags to riches. But Kohelet puts a twist on the story, that youth is then supplanted by a second wise youth who rises from obscurity to replace him. And Kohelet ends the story this way. There was no end to all the people, all whom he led, but those to come have no joy in him, for this too is mere breath and hurting the wind. Kohelet points out that people's loyalties are fickle. And so even when we find partnership, we often cannot place confidence in it. And so Kohelet names a number of relational realities here. The reality of being alone. The reality that even when you find partnership, whether that's in marriage or a close friendship or co-workers, partners in business, or in your extended family, that they can't always be relied upon. And so often we look to some sort of popularity or fame or reputation. And Kohelet says even that is fleeting. People will quickly pass on to the next person. They'll not long remember you after you're off the scene. So the question I would ask us here is, where have you experienced the blessing of two together? And where have you experienced the hurt of one, aloneness, the absence of those relationships? So Kohelet has considered relationships of power as well as relationships of mutual partnership. He now turns in a third and unexpected direction for this author. He reflects on the relationship we have with providence, with the hand of God, something he's not spent much time considering up until now. But in chapter 5, he turns for an extended reflection on our relationship to God and God's hand in our lives. And he begins this way: "Watch your step when you enter the house of God. The approach of one who listens is better than the sacrifice fools offer, for they have no knowledge of doing evil. Do not be quick with your tongue, and let not your heart hasten to speak before God. For God is in heaven, and you are on earth. Therefore, let your words be few. For a dream comes with much business, and the fool's voice with much talk." Kohelet begins by expecting that people will draw near to God, that they will come into God's house with words to say. And he mentions dreams. Dreams are how God, throughout the Old Testament in particular, conveyed messages to humanity. And so people come to God wanting to know what God is up to, wanting to know the divine plan, and coming with their prayers, their requests, asking that God's plans might benefit them. This is the dynamic that Kohelet envisions. And Kohelet advises that we not approach God with many, many words. And what Kohelet means is not to imagine that by our words we might force the divine hand, we might force God to bend to our will. He says, God is in heaven and you are on earth. Do not imagine for a moment that you can compel God to do what it is that you want. It's interesting that in these reflections, Kohelet is echoed centuries later by Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus, when teaching us to pray, said, "And when you pray, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles do, for they think that they will be heard for their many words." Jesus and Kohelet name a reality common in the ancient world as well as in many religious people today, that there are certain words we can say, certain rituals we can undertake that will bring about action from God that we will find favorable. Religion is often defined as that which we think can manipulate God's hand, forcing God to do as we please. And one of the most common ways that humans have devised to do that is vowing. To take a vow, to say to God, if you will do this, then I will do this. It imagines that we have something of value to offer to God, and that if we offer it to God correctly, God will be compelled to exchange something good for us. And so Kohelet now begins to explore the nature of vows and says in Ecclesiastes 5, "When you make a vow to God, do not delay to fulfill it, for there is no pleasure in fools. What you vow, fulfill. Better that you do not vow than that you vow and do not fulfill. Do not let your mouth make your body offend, nor say before the representative that it was a mistake." Kohelet here actually quotes Deuteronomy. Vows were part of Israelite life and religious practice in the Old Testament. And Deuteronomy allowed for and even encouraged the taking of vows, but said, you must fulfill what you vow. God will require it of you. And we see examples of people making vows throughout the Old Testament in this, if God you will, then I will do this formula. But Deuteronomy cautions and Kohelet stresses that we should not imagine that this puts us in a position of power over God. God will require of us what we vow. We cannot require it of God. I love this phrase in the midst of this passage, do not let your mouth make your body offend. It's a Hebrew way of the phrase we have, don't write checks with your mouth that your body can't cash. Kohelet is cautioning us against being rash and hasty and arrogant, presumptuous in our relationship with God. And he here names something that was apparently common, that when you would make a vow and not fulfill it, when the representative of the temple came to require it of you, You could simply say, oh, I made it in error. I made that vow hastily and didn't really mean it. I was crossing my fingers, in other words, and be let off. And Kohelet says, don't imagine that you can actually do that. And then he asks, why should God rage over your voice and ruin your handiwork? For in many dreams are mere breath and much talk. Instead, fear God. Kohelet concludes by saying, do not imagine that your words or your vows put you in a position of power over God. The appropriate posture is to fear God, to trust that God in heaven will do what is right. Now, Kohelet freely confesses that he doesn't understand how and when God will act, how and when God will set things to right. But it would be a mistake to think that Kohelet regards God as a distant and disinterested God. Kohelet believes that God is active in humans' lives. He just isn't sure exactly how. And so he says earlier in Ecclesiastes 3:17, I said in my heart, the just man and the wicked God will judge, for there is a time for every matter, and every deed he assesses. And so, as we think about these three relationships, those of power, those of partnership, and those with providence, we are to be humble before God, trusting rather than trying to manipulate God's hand. We should engage in equal relationships with our fellow humans, seeking mutual good and not seeking to oppress or exercise power unjustly over our fellow humans. But it is this relationship with God that defines the rest of it. Kohelet says, fear God. So the final question I have for us is, what are you expecting God to fix? What is it that you wish God would work out differently in your life? What are the words that you are bringing to God? And what is it that you need to release into God's hands, to trust that God in His time and in His way will bring about for the best?